and welcome to this special event, this online webinar, Baku and Beyond, where we're going to discuss what just happened at the United Nations Climate Change Summit in Baku, COP29, and consider the road ahead towards COP30 in Belém next year. My name is Bob Ward. I'm the Policy and Communications Director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. I will introduce our panel shortly, but let me just go through some logistical issues. So we're going to start with some brief comments, 10 minutes each, 10 to 15 minutes each from each of the panelists with their thoughts about COP29. The audience can put questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen at any point. So please do, and you'll have a chance to vote on those questions that are in there. And when we come to the Q&A section, I will choose questions partly based on the popularity. We're going to try and finish on time at 11:30, so we have about 90 minutes altogether. Please don't try and use the chat function. You won't be able to use it if you're a member of the audience. Please do put your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom. We are recording this so that others can access it afterwards. So if for any reason you're supposed to be somewhere else, then please don't put anything in the Q&A function that would identify you. But by and large, we hope that you will enjoy interacting with the panel today. So let me just introduce very quickly our panelists. So we're very delighted to have Alison Campbell with us. Alison is has been the lead UK negotiator at the COP process within the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. We also have Nicholas Stern, who is chair of the Grantham Research Institute and also co-chair of the independent high-level expert group on climate finance. Timo Leiter, who is a distinguished policy fellow here at the Grantham Research Institute and is heavily involved in and has been for many years involved in the adaptation negotiations at the COP and is a contributor to the UNEP adaptation gap report. And then we have Jodianne Wang, who is a policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute, works within the Just Transition Finance Lab and is currently also a PhD student at the University of Oxford. That's the order in which the introductory remarks will be made. So I'm going to start by inviting, I'm not going to do an introduction, but I'm going to let Alison give us a general overview of the outcomes and other noteworthy parts from COP29. So over to you, Alison.
Thanks very much, Bob. Nice to be back on your panel. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to start with a little bit of a disclaimer, which is that I'm on leave at the end of my role in the UK government. I start with the UN Secretary General's office next week. So I'm very much here expressing my own views, and hopefully you saw Ed Miliband's oral statement in the House of Commons on the COP29 outcomes last week, but I'll give a bit of flavour and a few headlines from my perspective. And I think maybe the first thing to say is a word about the context we had going into COP29. I think it was clear it was always going to be a difficult COP. We had a difficult geopolitical situation where, aside from everything else going on in the world, we just had the US election coming in. We'd had a year of record temperatures and impacts. We were coming off COP28 in Dubai and the agreement to transition away from fossil fuels, which had got significant pushback throughout the year. And then obviously we had finance as the main agenda, where we had to agree a new finance goal to replace the 100 billion at a time where the fiscal situation, in donors countries, yes, but also obviously in debt squeezed vulnerable countries as well, was looking really difficult. But I do think at the same time we went into COP feeling that everyone was there to get a deal and an outcome. And from the UK perspective, we had 5 main things that we wanted to deliver. The first was a new climate finance goal, or NCQG, if you like acronyms, and I'll focus on that in a second. The second was really sending strong signals on NDCs ahead of the next ambition round. We've all seen the latest reports from the UN, which show what we already know, that we're way off track for 1.5, and that this round of NDCs to 2035 is the last one that can get us on track. We knew as the UK that our own NDC was going to be important in setting the tone and a high bar for ambition. And so I think that the Prime Minister's announcement of an 81% reduction on 1990 levels that he made at the start of COP was really important. And we also had important announcements from Brazil and the UAE. But that was, an important signal to send. The third thing that we were focused on was following up on the energy transition outcomes of the global stocktake last year, and specifically, that paragraph 28 on transitioning away from fossil fuels. And I think it's fair to say there that the outcomes at COP29 were disappointing, and I'll come on to that in a second in more detail as well. The fourth thing was continued progress on adaptation and loss and damage. I think on both of these, in terms of the process, it was a bit of a strange year because it was more about making progress, for example, on adaptation, on the indicators that need to be agreed in Belém, and then less about kind of definitive outcomes at COP29. But I think the progress made there was mixed, and I know there are others in the panel that will talk to that in more detail. And then fifth and finally, we needed to finalise Article 6, the rules on carbon markets. And that was really something we thought we dealt with at COP26, but 3 years on, we were still going. So we really needed to finalise agreement at COP29. And I think the fact that that was done at COP29 represented a big positive. So those were the 5 things that we were really focused on. I'm going to focus mostly now on the finance and mitigation parts, because they were the 2, I guess, big ticket outcomes and the 2 big fault lines in the negotiations. And I think, looking at the outcome, it's fair to say overall it was mixed at best, and kind of reflected the difficult situation that we were in Baku. But starting with finance, the big outcome was obviously the agreement of a new finance goal to replace the 100 billion from 2026. And I think it's fair to say that the deal that we got was one which was both really important to get, but also one that made nobody happy. And I think that's because the difference between what we all know is needed and what donors felt was possible to deliver from public budgets was quite large. And so we felt that given the context we were in, the deal represents an important step forward and something to build on, even though it's not something that everybody was delighted about. And I'm sure Lord Stern will have his opinions there too. But from our perspective, I think the overall shape of the deal was in some ways one that the UK had advocated for, I guess, in 3 main ways. So firstly, it set the overall context of the need to scale up finance to meet the needs for developing countries from external financing of 1.3 trillion. Secondly, it then set a core goal of 300 billion to be mobilised from public finance. And this is really similar in character to the previous 100 billion, in that it's developed countries who have the overall responsibility for mobilising it. But importantly, it also now includes all the outflows from the MDBs, which brings in contributions of China, Saudi Arabia and others, whilst also kind of encouraging bilateral contributions from those countries on a voluntary basis. And I think this was important to walk the line between needing a goal that was true to Article 9 of the Paris Agreement and reflecting the fact that it's developed countries who have obligations on climate finance, but also demonstrating that the world has moved on since 1992 and there are other countries who are and should be providing climate finance as well. So again, like an imperfect, but an outcome that I think was needed to move us forward. And then thirdly, the goal speaks to a number of the quality elements that were always going to be important for developing countries, like the improvements that need to be made on access to climate finance, on driving public finance to adaptation, on concessionality, and on addressing issues like cost of capital, debt, and other issues constraining fiscal space. And I think the goal in particular needed to speak to the needs of the LDCs and SIDS, the small island states, which was a sticking point until right at the end, but where a compromise was found around the need to look at resource mobilization in the future, and to make sure it is getting to all of the constituencies that need it. So we felt that more could have been done on those quality elements, but they were certainly addressed more thoroughly than they had been in the previous 100 billion, where that was really non-existent. So I think overall it was a finely balanced and therefore imperfect deal, but it was important to get the deal, as I've said. The 300 billion wasn't as high as developing countries wanted, but it was a number that most donors felt represented the absolute limit of what they could commit to in the current fiscal situation. And I think one of the things that made the deal acceptable was the inclusion of a roadmap to the 1.3 trillion that needs to be developed by Belém, and that can bring that number to life in terms of what needs to be done to achieve it, including looking at some of the innovative finance options. So moving on to the mitigation outcomes, I think it's fair to say that from our perspective, these were incredibly disappointing. It's fairly mind-boggling that there was no mention really of 1.5 in the Baku outcome, or strong signals on NDCs. The mitigation work programme could, best be described as lowest common denominator. And I think the fact that the small island states, the least developed countries, ILAC, the EU and the umbrella group, all chose to reject the outcome on global stocktake follow-up, spoke volumes, because that was where we needed to deal with how we were taking forward the energy transition, the transition away from fossil fuels. And we decided in this case that no outcome was better than an outcome that would walk us backwards from Dubai. And I think these countries were very clear the whole way through COP that we needed to see outcomes that took the energy transition package forward. But there were some parties who were opposed to that, and the presidency chose not to include any language on that in any of the texts that they put forward. So that's something that we'll now need to rectify in Belém. Outside the process, we did have a number of countries signing up to statement committing to 1.5 aligned NDCs. The UK launched the Global Clean Power Alliance, and I think these were positives. And I think in general, that outcome in Baku doesn't change the fact that the transition is happening and unstoppable. And we agreed what we agreed in Dubai, and that will be taken forward. But it was disappointing not to get a reflection of that in the outcome in Baku. So I guess just in summarising, what we essentially took from COP29 that represented progress was an outcome on finance and an outcome on Article 6. They're incredibly important. I think on most other areas, the progress was either non-existent, like on mitigation, or disappointing. And I haven't focused on it, but I'd add gender to that list, and the fact there was no agreement on the Just Transition Work Programme, which again, I know will be covered in more depth by the panel. But in terms of how it felt on the ground, it was a fairly odd COP. It felt like the negotiating time between the parties was fairly limited. The process was quite difficult to negotiate. There was a lot of last minute texts, but ultimately the will was there to get a deal on finance, and that's what happened, and that was important. And then maybe just one final word from a UK perspective. We really went to the COP trying to play a leadership role and a bridge building role. And I think the Prime Minister's presence and the NDC announcement, the role that Ed Miliband played, and also the role of our negotiating team in trying to reach across the lines, did make a difference in coming to the outcome as imperfect as it was. But I'll probably leave it there, Bob, and hand back to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Alison. Thank you for that excellent overall summary of progress, or the lack of it in many areas, but from a UK perspective. And we just say on behalf of us all, thank you for your leadership of the negotiation team over the past couple of years whilst you've been in this post. And we will wish you luck in your new role at the UNSG. If you have any questions for Alison, please put them in the Q&A, but I'm going to now ask Nick Stern to talk about his impression of COP29 and particularly around the climate finance outcome.
Thank you very much, Bob. And could I add my thanks to Alison for her leadership in the last couple of years. And also, it was good. It's not always good to be British, but I think in this particular case, the UK did play a very positive role in this COP, including the Prime Minister's early presence and statement, and the role of Ed Miliband and the team, and of course Alison leading that negotiation for the UK. What I wanted to do was talk about some of the numbers in finance, and just as important, the meaning of the numbers and what they cover. To help me do that, let me go back quickly to the COP15 in Copenhagen. I mean, that was famously cold, chaotic and quarrelsome, but it did sketch out a Copenhagen Accord, and that Copenhagen Accord was carried through into an agreement in Cancun in COP16 in 2010. And that was the first time, 2009, in Copenhagen, that the number 100 billion occurred. And excuse me, I'm just going to sneeze. It's very close to my heart in the sense that I negotiated, working very closely with Meles Zenawi, who was speaking for Africa and the African Union. And we negotiated with Mike Froman, who was working with Hillary Clinton. Meles and I had a number which was north of 200 billion, and we wanted it to be public. And we had a medium-term target also for 2015. Now, that during the course of discussions with Mike Froman, who's speaking for the US, that more than 200 billion by 2020, with at least half of it coming through by 2015, got changed in the following ways. 2015 was deleted, so it was just a 2020. The public and private words were added when we had argued it should be public, and the number came down to 100 billion. So I give that history because it's very important to recognize that this was a negotiated number. It wasn't really a number based on what was necessary to achieve what we needed to do in terms of temperature goals. So it was a negotiated number, and as such, it was necessary to get the Copenhagen Accord, and then, of course, the next year, the Cancun agreement. But that was its history, so it's important to understand. And the breakdown of the 100 was just really public and private. There wasn't much more detail than that. Over time, as attempts to measure whether the 100 had been achieved or not, it started to get some definition. And it was, in the end, roughly speaking, as we were building up to that 100 billion, without going into the specifics, it was roughly half of it through the MDBs, or at least that portion of the MDBs flows attributable to rich countries. And of the other half, that it was a bit more bilateral, and there was a small amount for the private sector directly attributable to the bilateral and the MDBs. So the 100 was unambiguously public and private from the beginning. There was always been lots of discussion with people who assert that it was all public. It was not. I would have liked it to have been all public. Other people would have liked it to have been all public, but it was not. It was public and private. So that's the history. And let me now turn to what we did. And this is work of Amar Bhattacharya, Veera Songway, and myself as co-chairs, with Eleanor Subarat of the Grantham Institute very much involved. What we tried to do was to say what investments by geography and by sector are necessary to deliver on the Paris Agreement. And the majority of those investments are energy transition, but of course, significant amounts for adaptation, loss and damage, and natural capital. So we tried to do a deductive job, first looking at investments that were necessary, then asking what kind of finance would be necessary for what kind of investments. So mostly investment in renewable generation would be private sector. Mostly investments in natural capital would be public. So we looked at that overall investment need by geography and sector and indicated where we thought the finance could come from. Now, in most countries, investment is big majority financed internally. So in Keynesian macro terms, you know, your I or your investment is mostly financed by your S or your domestic savings. But of course, in many poorer countries, external savings or external flows are going to be important. So we came up with a number for 2030, and we did focus on 2030. I'll come back to that, although we ran numbers forward to 2035. We came up with a number of overall investment in emerging markets and developing economies outside China. China, of course, extremely important, but does not need external finance. So emerging markets, developing economies outside China, investment needs of around 2.4 trillion as a flow by 2030. Now, that's the overall investment flow in the areas which I just described. We reckon that around 1.4 trillion in 2030 could be financed internally, and that would leave $1 trillion for the external flows. Now, if you look at 2035, the overall trillion of external flows becomes roughly 1.3 trillion. So the 1.3 trillion for 2035 of external flows comes from work. That's the number that emerges from the Bhattacharya-Songwei-Stern report. And that number is there. And it is the external flows, and it breaks down very roughly a half of private, and that's 650, and then the other half would break down 325 from the multilateral development banks and 325 from a multiple of other sources. All this based around the kind of finance that would be necessary for the kind of investments we're talking about. So that's where the 1.3 trillion came from. It was deductive around what was necessary to deliver on Paris. Whilst our paper focused on 2030, we did give the numbers for 2035, and they took in the negotiations the 1.3 trillion as external flows necessary. Now, a number of developing countries chose to interpret that 1.3 trillion as all public. And that's why I gave the history of Copenhagen. There was an attempt to do it there, but it quite explicitly was public and private. And in our deductive work, we looked at the breakdown in terms of the kinds of investments and whether they were likely to get or should get private sector flows. So that 1.3 trillion was never intended to be an overall public flow. And to pretend otherwise is actually deliberate misinterpretation of the issue. Perhaps misunderstanding, but I think actually misinterpretation of the issue. So that's 1.3 trillion. Now, how do you get from that overall structure of 1.3 broken down, 650 private, 325 MDB and 325 the rest? How do you get to the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal? Well, what you do is you try to say how much of that should be bilateral or likely to be bilateral, how much from the MDBs and how much from the private sector flows directly attributable to those MDB and bilateral flows. That was, as it were, the conventional method we now have that was used for the 100 billion applied to the overall framework which we described. And if you back it out in that way, we get to a number for 2035 of around 400 billion. And the actual agreement was 300 billion for 2035. So that 300 was obviously times 3 relative to the old 100, but fell significantly short of what we would argue as an NCQG, calculated in that rather sort of formal way, what it was short of the 400, which we indicated was implicit in our numbers. So it is a major step forward, but it's not as far as we would have wished. But to pretend that the 300 is something like a quarter relative to the 1.3 or less than a quarter of the 1.3 and therefore dramatically short is a deliberate misinterpretation of the numbers. It's significantly short, but it's not, as it were, a factor of 4 short, which is what has been suggested through the misinterpretation of the 1.3 as necessarily all public flows. Now, I'm probably out of time here, but Bob, let me just add one remark on ways forward, or 2 remarks on ways forward. The first is that 325 of MDB flows implicit in the 1.3 trillion or explicit in the 1.3 trillion would be a quadrupling of flows from the MDBs. Our number for 2030, based on the 1 trillion external flows, would involve a tripling of the flows of the MDBs by 2030. So in a sense, although I'm not sure it's sufficiently sunk in, the numbers that have been large measure accepted at COP29 involve a quadrupling of the MDB flows by 2035 and a tripling by 2030. That's very important, and that's something which the world as a whole can get together and try to make happen. The second is that third category of very low cost concessional finance, which comes from overseas development assistance, it comes from voluntary carbon markets, from special drawing rights, from philanthropy, and from these more innovative sources or solidarity payments. And those innovative sources, I think, are again something where we could work very strongly between now and 2030. So MDBs, lots to do, and that's an international all get together and try to make it happen. The voluntary carbon markets, I think those have been boosted somewhat by the progress in Baku, which Alison described, and Laurence Toubiana is leading a team working on the solidarity payments is what they're called, or innovative finance. And the most promising elements there would be a tax on maritime and a tax on jet fuel. Those, quite remarkably, are essentially untaxed. And when you fly, the jet fuel you use is untaxed, and that is quite extraordinary. So it is important that those solidarity funds do start to appear, and I think maritime and aviation most likely. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick, for that very insightful explanation, not just of the outcome from COP29, but the origin of the 100 billion, which I think many people may not know. That's how it came about. So just a reminder to the audience, if you want to ask a question of the panel, please type it in the Q&A section, and there you can go and vote for those questions that we already have lined up in there. Lots of good questions in there. We're going to move on next to Timo Laito, who's going to talk about adaptation, and then we'll come to Jodie-Ann. So Timo, over to you. And I think Timo has some slides which he's going to share with us.
Yes, hi everyone. I think the slides should be.
The slides are showing, Timo, but we can't hear you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Alison and Nick, for all these insights. And I'm going to focus on adaptation at COP29. There was quite a bit happening. So let's jump in straight. So first, as a recap, okay, what was the situation that we came into from the previous COP? So In COP28, a landmark decision was reached to, for the first time, adopt a global policy framework on adaptation that is applicable to all countries. And all countries agreed to have 11 global targets on adaptation, 7 thematic ones and 4 policy-oriented ones for countries to achieve by 2030. And a work program was launched on indicators for those targets. So what were the open questions that COP29 was about to address on adaptation? Around these indicators, so one of the questions was, should there be global indicators or not? So even though this seems to be self-evident to have global indicators for global targets, there were a number of countries which are resisting that. So one of the questions was, okay, now that we have agreed to those targets, how can we track their implementation and where's the accountability to reach them? Another key ask from developing countries was to have indicators for means of implementation, because they argued if they don't get the means of implementation, they cannot implement those targets in their countries. And also, there was a demand to link the global goal on adaptation and all the work around the targets to the new quantified global goal on adaptation, and to establish that link, and also how the indicators would link to the global stocktake. So these were some of the open issues, and then it was also about transformational adaptation, which is a topic of importance to some countries, but not others. And finally, a major ask from developing countries was to have the GGA as a standing agenda item, since in the past there often wasn't in an agenda item overall on adaptation, at least not before Glasgow. The UK introduced it in Glasgow. So let's have a look on some of the outcomes on these open questions that were reached at the COP at CMA 6. So countries did agree to develop a manageable set of no more than 100 indicators that track progress towards the 11 global targets on adaptation, with a focus on capturing global trends. And very importantly, that these indicators are now mandated to be used in the second global stocktake. And that's important because the first global stocktake, which was concluded last year in Dubai, said very little about adaptation to climate change. So now in the second global stocktake, we will have far more information on adaptation in a much more systematic way. And also, countries did agree that there should be, as appropriate, indicators for enabling factors, including means of implementation. So developing countries did get this demand, and indicators for means of implementation are now part of the scope of the development of these indicators. And the sentence again, why these indicators are so important. The MDBs are already looking at funding, basically adjusting their funding to these global targets and to the indicators. And lastly, it was decided that the funding mechanisms under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement have to report on how they support these 11 global targets. So these indicators will be very influential in channeling finance. And if indicators are done in a way that is not suitable or not meaningful, it could also channel finance in the wrong way. And therefore, it's very important to get this right. Other matters were decided on the GGA. It was decided to have a standing agenda item on the GGA. And new Baku adaptation roadmap was launched. So this is separate from the 1.3 trillion roadmap. A roadmap to discuss further matters on adaptation, including support, and on transformational adaptation. Very quickly, so the Pacific Island states in particular are very keen to advance this topic. They're saying that this is the only way for them to adapt. Business as usual adaptation doesn't work. But there are other countries in Arab group and LMDCs in particular, and also the African group, which really didn't want to engage on this topic at all. The argument being it would be another barrier to accessing finance. So a compromise was reached to have a reader-friendly report on this topic based on the report that was published, and to take this up in June. and a little more detail on the work of the experts. So it was decided in June this year to have expert groups to develop or to make proposals for the indicators. And I co-lead one of these expert groups, the largest one, which is on the adaptation policy cycle. So we have been asked, under the guidance of the chairs of the SBs, to produce a list of consolidated indicator options by May, from which the negotiators can then, pick, choose, decide, negotiate which ones they want to further support. And we have to come up with recommendations for the use of these indicators, which is also very important. It's not just indicators shouldn't be developed for the purpose of indicators, but to achieve something. And there will be technical reports by May, which will then be negotiated at the SB's session in June. And overall, parties reaffirmed their intention to adopt a list of final indicators at the COP in Belém. So hopefully we will get that over the course of next year. And this is the final slide, and this is the overview slide, because actually there were many agenda items on adaptation. The global goal on adaptation was the most important one, but there were also other ones, and I've used these traffic light colors to signal, the outcome. Overall, the decisions did not, the negotiations did not go well at all. There was no agreement on national adaptation plans at all, which is very unfortunate. There was no agreement for the third time in a row on the review of the effectiveness of the adaptation committee, which was also very unfortunate. On the adaptation committee's annual report, there was a minimal agreement to welcome the report, which was absolutely the minimum that they could have done. You would think that it should be straightforward to at least take note of a report, but it isn't. And there are many political, deeper political tensions that are behind these no agreements. There's a report that was asked to have developed countries to produce on the doubling of adaptation finance, which developed countries agreed to do in Glasgow by 2025. On this matter in particular, countries couldn't even agree on a text that acknowledged the existence of the report. So this gives an indication of the level of tension and political disagreement that unfortunately shaped most of the outcomes on adaptation. On the NCQG, to many, at least especially developing country negotiators, it was very disappointing that there was no particular sub-goal on adaptation funding, but the decision does take note of the adaptation funding gap in multiple times. So overall, to conclude, we have seen a very productive discussions on the global goal on adaptation, which was very good and very useful, gives us what we need as experts to continue next year. The other adaptation items, unfortunately, not going very well, which is in line with what Alison said about the mixed views from the COP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Timo, for that very comprehensive and succinct overview of on adaptation, and good that there was progress on the global goal on adaptation, but very disappointing to see so little progress on the other aspects of it. To the audience, if you want to ask a question of the panel, we'll be coming to you shortly. Please put your questions in the Q&A function and vote for your favorite questions down there. We'll move on now to Jodian Wang, who's going to talk about the just transition element. If you want to.
Yes.
Jodian?
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for being here. I think just a little bit of a context of why the need to talk about the just transition and how it came to be. It's a relatively newer work program that was decided at COP27 of the 4th CMA. To have a work program on the just transition to discuss how to achieve Article 2.1 of the Paris Agreement in context of Article 2.2. And since Sharm el-Sheikh, there's been two dialogues, two dialogues amongst parties as well as constituencies on the Just Transition Work Program, and two high-level ministerial roundtables as well on the Just Transition Work Program. So far, I think there's been a lot of focus on opportunities, challenges, and barriers to implement a just transition. There's been a lot of talking, and what COP29 revealed was there's more needs for actually doing just transition and thinking about how to do the just transition. we've come a long way since the just transition as a concept was first kind of pioneered and pushed for by the labor struggles in the US in the 1970s, and it was included in the Paris Agreement. But the UNFCCC, I think, as I need to say, is by no means the only place where discussions around the just transition has taken place or should take place, because of the grounded impacts of what the just transition means to workers and communities and people around the world. There's a really strong push to make sure that it does not just stay within the international climate politics circle, but actually take into account its grounded effects. And perhaps here I will pause and just say that COP29, amidst many disappointments, the just transition outcome was one of it, where it did not end up with an outcome text on the just transition work program. There was no agreement reached on where to go from here on moving forward. And so I think a lot of the progress that we saw during the week 1 of COP, there's grievance over whether that is still there or whether that's completely lost. So I think there's a lot of work to do moving forward. But perhaps just to touch a bit on, well, how do we get to the point where there was no agreement? Where were the key contention points? I think the first issue is the lack of convergence, particularly on the scope of the Just Transition work program. This is despite agreement since COP28 that this work program is about how to connect climate policies with social and economic priorities, which should not have been really separated in the first place. That this work program should look at, the implications and opportunities that the just transition can bring to workers, but also broader affected communities, including women, people with disabilities, youth, indigenous peoples, etc. This also includes both a domestic and international dimension of the just transition, while countries need to take into account their domestic priorities and challenges and needs. Those had all been on the table, but I think time and time again in the just transition discussions, we see going back on these preliminary facts and trying to pull them apart. And there was disagreements over exactly what is meant to be discussed here, exactly what a just transition means. I think up until COP29, developed countries provided submissions and interventions on their views of the Just Transition Work Program as an experience sharing and knowledge hub that was quite mitigation heavy. I think if you recall from Bonn SB 60 this year, where one of the morning eco letters said Just Transition Work Program could have been an email. And I think there's a lot of grievances over whether this can just be a talking space, because for developing countries who they saw Just Transition Work Program as a place to express needs and address these gaps and talk about concrete work plans and concrete outcomes specifically focused on the means of implementation. So that's finance, that's capacity, and that's technology transfer and international cooperation. And this is a point that I want to come back to later, is the international dimension of the just transition cannot be lost in the work program and as well as in broader just transition discussions. So because of this convergence, and some may say that countries have started too far apart in terms of their needs, there was a lot of call for balanced text throughout the discussion, throughout the negotiations. There was a clear indication of how far countries started apart to begin with, and the need to kind of then redraft the text with all their opinions compiled in. There was a lot of brackets, and then in the streamlining process, because of kind of the power imbalances at play as well in these climate negotiations, oftentimes they get streamlined to developed country priorities, which is also what we saw in the NCQG negotiation process. So the lack of convergence is probably one of the first issue, and also I think the lack of vision and concrete deliverables, both amongst the parties as well as from the presidency, was another key fault line. I think on the coordination part, we saw some fragility and division within the G77 plus China bloc, with LMDCs, AGNs, AOCs, and LDCs kind of some trying to bridge convergence, and others just said that they couldn't work with the text. So there was very kind of little political signal to keep pushing. There was also, I think, across the board, some grievances over how the presidency could have facilitated some of the discussions to wield the convening power that it does have as the presidency. So both there were kind of issues on the procedural end as well as on the political end. So week 1, there were technical negotiations ongoing, but by week 2, when technical negotiation didn't wrap up, it was left in the hands of the presidency, who could decide to either let the technical negotiations go forward or escalate it to the ministerial level. And in the case of the Just Transition Work Program, while there were still some technical conversations happening, it went to the ministerial level that was much more political and leaves less room for parties to speak to each other, as opposed to speak to the front of the room. So there was less room for kind of actually talking about the text. So in a way, during week 2, Just Transition got a little bit sidelined until it wasn't until November 21st, late evening, that kind of text came out, and that had a lot of brackets and and then once again evoked a lot of grievances from both sides, feeling like their text was not kind of reflected in what was circulated. We saw over the course of the 2 weeks, especially during week 1, and then toward the latter half of week 2, that language came and gone. There were moments of excitement where the texts were referring to kind of global stocktake in the introduction and also there were deliberate mentions of respecting and promoting and considering human rights, including rights to development, education for sustainable development, decent work, labor rights. We didn't see those texts staying, as well as texts on gender equality, empowerment of women and youth, care work and informal work being part of the Just Transition Work Program negotiations. So there was a lot of disappointments with how kind of complex we can make the Just Transition and how we actually take into account in these text outcomes the priorities and the precarity of people who are most impacted by the transition. What I will say here, a key takeaway for me is that the Just Transition Work Program should not and cannot sit in silo, and we need to read the Just Transition across other agenda items, including mitigation, adaptation, and at least finance, because finance keeps being a bottleneck in the Just Transition negotiations. I think at some point when the NCQG negotiation was stuck, there was very much civil society grievances that was being aired, that, you know, Just Transition discussions was being held hostage because there was no money on the table. And this Just Transition finance link and Just Transition link with other means of implementation is extremely important, because, as you know, earlier speakers touched on the composition of the 1.3 trillion versus the 300 billion goal, developed countries taking the lead. For developing countries in both finance and Just Transition, especially looking at the nexus of the two, they're looking at the history of the financial system in the lead up to the NCQG, and not just looking forward, but also need to look backwards at historical grievances. And that is when we know that 55 of the countries most vulnerable to climate change have already lost over 500 billion to impacts like sea level rise and storms, despite only accounting for 4% of global emissions. That is when we know that the IEA said that there's extremely high cost of financing, that the affordability of clean energy for developing countries really depends on reducing the cost of capital, which is about 7 times higher for financing the same projects in the US and Europe. In countries, in regions where there are even higher levels of perceived risk, that cost of capital is higher as well. So when we see contentions on the finance negotiations over public versus private and the structure of the goal, that really gets reflected in Just Transition and other negotiation items as well. And I think that also played a role into kind of the no agreement outcome in the end. That was a disappointment to many, but particularly for developing countries who frankly have to stand the most to gain, but also the most to lose from something of an outcome like this. There's a lot to be said on where to go from here, and looking forward to COP30, where there could be kind of being framed as a justice COP, and I'll come to that later. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Jodie, and for an update on a relatively new area, but vital area of the negotiation process. And again, it's disappointing that more progress wasn't made. So we're going to come to your questions now. If you want to put a question in the chat, please do, but I'm going to ask the panel to turn their cameras on and we'll start dealing with some of the questions. I will, in about half an hour, ask the panelists just briefly for their views on the year ahead leading up to COP30 and what they're hoping to see. But let's deal with some of the questions that have already been put in. The first one is for you, Nick. It's from Katie Swan Nelson. It's quite a long question, so I'm going to summarize it. Essentially, in the analysis of the investment needs for the developing countries outside China, the report of the independent high-level expert group assumed that $1 trillion a year could be mobilized from domestic sources. And Katie asked, is that realistic given current debt burdens on and continuing debt burdens on developing countries? Because Katie's done some modeling for UNCTAD and showed that the potential mobilization is much less than that, although it's not clear whether that modeling was both public and private or just public. But do you want to address the general question of the challenge of increasing domestic resource mobilization in developing countries whilst they're dealing with severe debt burdens?
Yeah, happy to do that. Let me take the headline numbers from our report, which were around 2030. If you want to translate them to 2035, just scale up by a factor of around 1.3. And the reason I'm doing that is that we provided more detail on 2030, but also there was an element of focusing on 2035 of kicking the can down the road a bit, and I'd like to bring it back to a closer time of 2030. So looking at the investment flows in the areas that we described, we came up with 2.4 trillion of investment flows in 2030 as necessary in the 4 areas I described: energy transition, adaptation, resilience, loss and damage, and natural capital. So those were the flows of investment necessary. Now that is a factor of around 4 relative to what's going on now, and that reflects particularly that the big bulk of investment in the energy transition has been in the rich countries and in China. Africa has, maybe 50 or 60% of the world's solar potential, but only for electric power, but only about 2% of the investment. So what we're talking about is significant scaling up in those areas. Now, roughly speaking, in the countries we're talking about, investment is financed around 60% by domestic savings. Remember, in that group, you've got some really big countries like India and Indonesia and Brazil and South Africa and Vietnam and so on. And they, the big bulk of the numbers are there. And so we didn't assume that so let me just step back slightly. If you take those countries and ask what fraction generally is financed internally of investment relative to externally, the number is ballpark 70%. So I think I might have just said 60, but the number is ballpark 70%. We assumed a lower fraction than that, more like 60%. I do think if you look at the overall composition of those countries, the big bulk of the numbers lie in the countries where I just described. And I do think that for those countries, financing the bulk of it through domestic resource mobilization is possible. It's a stretch, but it's possible. And remember, what we're talking about here is the public finances plus the domestic capital markets. So a big part of the support that rich countries should be offering is around domestic resource mobilization. That is strengthening the public finances and helping to build domestic capital markets. And let me just give one example. For the last 50 years, I've been working in one village, Palanpur, in Moradabad district of UP in India, Uttar Pradesh in India. That is a poor village in one of the poorest states in India. And if you look there at how investment is financed, I'm thinking particularly of a villager buying a mobile phone which will connect to markets, or buying a solar panel which will charge the mobile phone, or buying a 10 centimeter bore in order to lift water. Those are investments made by very poor people who finance it out of their own savings or some local borrowing. So I think it's very important to recognize that the bulk of investment is development investment. It's investment that needs to be made in order to take development forward. And what we're assuming is that it will be done in a cleaner way, but that investment, of course, needs to be financed. So I think what we're describing here in terms of domestic resource mobilization is about a country mobilizing resources for its own development, but doing it in a very different way from the past, which is of great benefit to them and, of course, a great benefit to the world. And historical obligations mean that the rich countries have a duty to help with that story. But one of the things that's changed in the discussion on finance for investment is the recognition of the reality that investment is generally financed, majority, and sometimes big majority, by domestic savings, public and private.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick, for that answer. And Katie has also emailed me so I can connect her with the team to talk about their modelling, etc. But thank you for dealing with the general issue. So we move on to the next question from George Carew Jones. It's also about the NCQG. I'm going to ask Alison first to have a response and then maybe ask Nick to comment. So there's been a lot of discussion about the figures that were contained in the decision around the NCQG, the 1.3 trillion and the 300 billion figure, whether they've taken into account inflation or whether they're actually even smaller than they look once you take those factors into account. So Alison, I don't know whether you can answer whether there was any specific discussion in the negotiations about whether those figures are pegged to a particular year or whether it was deliberately left unclear, and what the implications might be.
Thanks. Sure. So I guess the headline is that in the calculations, certainly that we did as the UK on what was possible and that other donors did, inflation was factored in. So we looked at inflation, we looked at what the MDBs were likely to do on the basis of their most recent forecasts, and then we looked at what else on top it's impossible for bilateral donors to do. And then we looked at kind of what might happen in different scenarios to the kind of private sector mobilization part of the goal, which, of the 100 billion was actually a very limited amount because we weren't very good at doing it. And they were all of the factors that came together in working out what was going to be possible. And then obviously different donors had different calculations and different views of which of those scenarios were most likely. And so that was obviously part of the conversation as well, amongst donors. But just to, I don't know if it will reassure, but that was taken into account. And then I think there's another question in the chat that there will be a requirement for extra bilateral effort on top of that. I think that's, it's clear. A lot of donors thought that was, something that was stretching in the current fiscal situation where it's difficult to see the public finances increasing, but they will have to in the 300 billion scenario.
Very good, thank you. So just to be clear, are you saying that we should assume that those figures are in 2024 dollars or in 2035 dollars?
I'm saying they took into account the inflation. We have analysts who did the actual calculation, so I don't want to give you a specific, but inflation was taken into account in working out what we thought was possible. Okay,
very good. Nick, do you want to just clarify in terms of the numbers that were in the H-leg report, how they dealt with inflation?
Our numbers in the H-leg report, the group chaired by Amar Bhattacharya, Vera Songwe and myself, were in 2022 dollars. So if the 1.3 trillion is sourced in our work, and I think that's the only place it does come from, to be quite honest, then they should be scaled up for inflation. But what was implicit in writing that 1.3 in is not entirely clear to me. But if we were doing the numbers, that 1.3 trillion would be in 2022 dollars.
Very good. Okay, thank you. That's very clear. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. From John McClintock. In overall terms, do you think that the COP process is bringing about the level of international cooperation which is required to resolve the climate collective action problem? I think I know what most people are going to say, but who here would like to give the most positive negative answer to this? So can we start with Timo and maybe Jodianne, and then ask Alison and Nick if they want to. So Timo first, and Timo in particular, because you've been involved for a few years in the process, and at least if it's not optimal, are we at least on an upward path, or at least? So Timo first, and then maybe Jodianne.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. That's a question that you get very regularly, and I'm on the optimistic side of it. So one question is, what do we expect from the COP? If the expectation is that the COP will magically solve the climate crisis, then the COP cannot fulfill it. The reason why we have the blockage, particularly on mitigation ambition, is that there are countries which have, which don't want to reduce their revenue stream from the selling of oil and gas. And that needs to be, that's the blocking issue. It's not an issue of how the COP is organized. Also, that even after the adoption of the Paris Agreement, there have been people saying, okay, now we have the Paris Agreement, we don't need the COPs anymore, we need to shift to implementation mode. But that doesn't understand the way international law is being created. So all these decisions on the GGA indicators, the GGA framework, the Just Transition Program, all these things, they do need a forum to decide. So I keep saying the COP is like a parliament to the Paris Agreement and the convention. If the parliament doesn't meet, we don't make progress. Of course, that is frustrating. So the answer is there should be something in addition to the COP. There can be a climate club, the G20 is very important. All the other forums are important too. But dismantling the COP, abandoning the COP would not make things better, it would make things worse. And finally, and this is very important, the COP creates a momentum every year where all the ministers come together. It gets on the minister's desk in every single country of the world. And the ministers ask their officers, okay, what should I report back? So that momentum of the COP must not be underestimated. So yes, it is not delivering what we need, but if you wouldn't have it, things would be worse.
Thank you, Timo. And your audio is slightly disrupted at the moment. I should mention to the audience that you're joining us from Tanzania, so hopefully you'll still maintain with us. Jodianne, do you have anything to add on this?
I think I take a little bit more of a pessimistic view on this particularly. I mean, I don't think that the COP is the only place to kind of solve the climate crisis, and really shouldn't be, but also the site in which there's so much power and politics involved, even in the sense that how many negotiators can a country send, and how much is stretched between different agenda items to give it equal weight. And that's a material reality that we have to face. And looking at it from the just transition angle, like, we're trying to do just transition when there are so much inequalities at play, and we're trying to kind of do this consensus building mechanism. So sometimes that power imbalance gets obscured in these negotiation processes, and we have to be mindful of that. And can we go from a place where countries don't come to just articulate their lines and go from one session to the next? It's hard, but we really need additional spaces more, and just look beyond the COP as well, because the calendar year around climate action should not just be pre-COP, post-COP, and we go on an annual cycle.
Thank you, Jodianne. Nick and Alison, do you want to say anything? Nick?
Yes. The COP processes, if you look back, and I'll just look back to COP12. I've been to all the COPs since 2006, since COP12. I think the understanding of the challenges has deepened enormously in that time. And the COP processes, the COP events, have been quite important to that deepening. I mean, look at the difference between the very broad statements, and that people were talking about 80% reductions between 1990 and 2050. were really most of the time up to Paris. But then in Paris, we got some more clarity, and this, whilst the language net zero was not used in Paris, the equivalent language of balancing sources and sinks was used. So that's an example through those processes of a tightening of the understanding. We've had, in the time I've been going, as I said, since 2006, successful COPs at Cancun in 2010. That was the first time, for example, there was a financing goal, the famous 100 billion. We had the COP21 5 years later in 2015, Paris. And I think the Glasgow COP was also a landmark, particularly around the role of the private sector. And if we're talking about investment, we're talking about a majority private sector investment. And so having the private sector there was, I think Glasgow, it's fair to say, was one where the private sector presence kicked up a great deal. So that was COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. And I think that Belém has a chance of being a significant COP. So there have been steps up. They happen to have been roughly every 5 years, but significantly they've been around COPs which had a 2-year run. And the Cancun COP was preceded by Copenhagen. It was essentially a 2-year COP. COP21 in Paris was essentially a 2-year COP because of the very strong role, the tremendous role played by Peru in the year before, when texts for Paris were already being discussed in Peru a year ahead of time. And COP26 in Glasgow turned out to be a 2-year COP because of COVID. But it's interesting that the successful COPs have been every 5 years or so, and they've been 2-year COPs. And that's why I'm moderately less pessimistic around COP in Belém than I would have been about some of the other COPs. The second point that I wanted to make is that COPs deal largely with environment ministers, when so much of the action is around finance ministers and ministries. And it's actually in finance ministries and with finance ministries that I've spent much of my own professional life. And I have a deep respect and love for environment ministers. But that doesn't mean they carry the clout. They don't carry the financial clout. And often, as we've seen in many of the discussions that I just referred to, they actually don't understand the finance numbers. So the 1.3 is interpreted as the number that the NCQG should have been. Well, I mean, that's just a failure to understand what the numbers mean and how they've been put together. So whilst some environment ministers are really very good at the finance side, and I would include Ed Miliband, let me be clear, in that, a lot of them just don't get it. And they don't have the power to make finance commitments. They're always referring to somebody else. So that's why I think that, I really want to stress this second point strongly, we have to have arenas where finance ministries get together and try to make things happen. The G20 is the most powerful group, but of course that's the 20 biggest economies in the world, and there are another 180 economies which are much smaller that often feel shut out from that. But if you look at the numbers, that's where they are. And so G20 finance ministers is a very important part of the story, and that is happening. And I also think that many of you will know that we've been very active at the Grantham Institute in helping put together the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action, which now has nearly 100 finance ministries. The network on greening the financial system, which is central banks, has rather more than 100 members. So I do think that those arenas where finance can be discussed by those who understand it and have the power, I think are going to be very important. And I would include the meetings of the multilateral development banks around that, because for me, the quadrupling by 2035 of financial flows from the multilateral development banks and the multilateral climate funds. That is absolutely critical to everything else, including the multiplications we need in the private sector.
Thank you very much, Nick. So, Alison, I'm going to ask you to comment on improvements to COP process, but also fold in the question from Bianca Cinelli, which is the following. There are calls for implementing changes to the current COP negotiation process. In your view, which changes could have real impact in effectively implementing the Paris Agreement, particularly in relation to mitigation? So I guess you might be slightly constrained while still technically on leave from the UK government, but based on your experience, I think any reflections on how the COP process could be improved, I think would be the audience would be very keen to hear.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I guess just on that kind of bigger picture question on whether the COP process is bringing about the level of cooperation required. I mean, I would say, obviously the only way we can do this is through international cooperation, and I think the Paris Agreement is the best forum we've got for that, and it actually has had impact. If you look at, we were heading for temperature rises of, say, like over 4 or 5 degrees before Paris, and now it's, somewhat, depending on exactly how you define it, somewhere around 2.5 degrees. And then we've got 90% of the world with net zero commitments, where they were very limited previously. So it's having an impact, but not fast enough. And clearly, we need to do better. And also, I think, as others have said, it can't do everything. And we need to make use of these other forums like the G20 and what the Brazilians did in bringing together finance and environment, climate ministers, to go into Nick's point, I think was important, and hopefully will be continued by the South Africans next year. I mean, just on the process question, I mean, it is, and by virtue of any process where you need 198 countries to actually agree on the same thing, it is imperfect and it's quite difficult to change. It's like kind of turning an oil tanker, I guess. But I do think there are a few opportunities. I mean, one of the things that the consensus means unanimity in our world, and I think that there's always a couple of countries that can hold things back, and I think that's just the fact of the world that we're dealing with. But I do think more can be done around the process of someone's already mentioned the agenda. It's kind of spiraled slightly out of control. We don't actually even have a space at the moment where you can talk about mitigation in any meaningful way, and yet there's hundreds of agenda items. So I think there's a combination of rationalization around the process and what it looks like, but that's hard to do because everyone has to agree to do it. I think the biggest thing actually is the political will on and the diplomatic engagement that needs to go around the edges of it to make sure that every country is kind of going to the COP, ready to agree. So no easy answers, but I do think that, as Nick said, there is opportunity for the Brazilians to play that role going forward to Belém.
Thank you very much indeed, Alison. The next question is from Simon Evans, and it's put to you, Alison. So it's a question about the UAE dialogue, and Simon would like you to say a bit more about what happened on the UAE dialogue. In particular, was the final draft rejected in plenary? Was that a spontaneous rejection, or was it expected? And what do you think of the prospects of something more substantive on the dialogue agenda at COP30?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So I think anyone who had been listening to the vast majority of parties and what they wanted from the follow-up to the UAE dialogue would not, would have expected that text to be rejected. Because in our view, it really represented the views of a very small number of parties, not the majority, and it was never going to be good enough. When that final text came out, it was really the first time we'd had a full text from the presidency. So before there'd been set options, some of which might have been acceptable, and so it was hard to kind of see where it was coming out until right at the very end. And I think countries were just not willing to be forced into accepting that, because it's not something that they had seen before, and it's not something that was good enough. And I think that had been made clear, throughout the 2 weeks. So obviously there were a number of us who were coordinating quite closely on that, on the small island states, the least developed countries, as well as the EU and us. And so we were all obviously exchanging about it, and then it was very clear that it wasn't going to be accepted by anyone. So it wasn't a surprise to me when it got rejected in the plenary. But I guess for those who hadn't been kind of in those conversations, it might have looked quite surprising. So I think in terms of prospects for, I'm hopeful of the prospects for Belém on that, because I really hope that the presidency will run, an open and transparent process to get us to the place where we actually have some really clear follow-up articulated from Dubai. And I do always think that when you have a COP where something like that fails, it really, puts the pressure on to get something better the next year, which is the benefit of the kind of multi-year process. And I hope that will be the outcome this time, because I think it's clear from the majority of parties that has to happen.
Thank you very much indeed, Alison. What I'm going to do now is ask each of the panelists to kind of just lay out very quickly, no more than 2 minutes, what their hopes are for the year ahead leading up to COP30 in particular, any key developments that you would like to see. So I was going to start with Timo, then go to Jodianne, then Nick, and then Alison. So Timo, particularly on adaptation, what would you like to see happen in the next 12 months leading up to Belém?
Yeah, thank you. And adding to what Alison just said, and on mitigation, even though that's not the area I follow, but of course there are hopes for the next COP to have more ambition on mitigation. One of the listeners to our webinar asked, how can the next COP be better? Well, the presidency has far more time, or has had more time to prepare, so hopefully there will be more mitigation ambition with the new NDCs coming in, and also initiatives from the UN Secretary General around that. So that's what I hope for on mitigation. On adaptation, it's really for this process of the experts, in which I'm very closely involved, to make good proposals by May. This is looking good. So there were really very productive discussions in that negotiation room. And so if we get to good midterm SPs in June with good indicator proposals, I'm hopeful that countries will agree to a list of indicators at COP30 that make sense and can also channel finance in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Jodianne?
Yeah, I think 4 things for me. One is we need to see just transition in the next round of NDCs to show that it's cross-cutting across the climate planning in the nation's priority in general. And the second thing is that we need to break the just transition into more manageable chunks within the work program. Look at transitioning away from fossil fuels, look at phasing into renewables, look at just transition implications in extractives, in food systems, in adaptation and resilience, because these are the different priorities that countries hold. And third thing is we need to look at the cross-border impacts of the just transition, how one place's transition affects another, can affect justice or injustice in another place. This was kind of front and center even from day one of this COP, looking at CBAM, but also this issue goes way beyond CBAM, this issue of cross-border impacts and interconnected justice. If you look at renewable energy transition and upstream extractive value chains, whose justice, whose injustice are we talking about here? So I think we're expected to see more of that coming in from COP30. Which is desperately needed. And the last thing is you really can't have a conversation about just transition if the climate finance works against recipient countries. So a lot hinges on the negotiation items and how they influence each other. And we need to take that into account in the Baku to Belém roadmap, but also in how the just transition work program can pick itself back up ahead of COP30.
Thank you very much. And Nick, in your comments, perhaps you could also address the question of how you think the COP process will cope with if, as expected, Donald Trump initiates the withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement.
Thank you very much, Bob. And I would agree with what Timo and Jodianne have just said. But let me, I'll do four things very quickly, including what you just described, Bob. But it's all around the criticality of investment. This is about sustainable development. It's about growing and developing and reducing poverty in a way that's very different from the dirty, destructive models of the past. It's about investment, investment, investment. And that's where I think we have to keep everything focused. As Xi Jinping said, you can't run down the old until you've built the new. In many cases, there's not much old, and there's a question and challenge of building the new. But we have to focus this around investment and sustainable development. And if you look back at the preamble of the Paris Agreement, excuse me, it is in large measure, that preamble, about seeing all this in the context of sustainable development. Sometimes there's a subtext saying that seems to suggest that if you're going to pursue sustainable investment, or if you're going to pursue climate and development at the same time, excuse me, then in some sense you have to grow more slowly. And that's dead wrong. This is about sustainable development, and the move to low carbon economy will drive development and poverty reduction forward. So that has to be kept at center stage. And if you have that perspective, then the driving force is within the developing, we're talking about here, the driving force is within the developing world. They choose their own patterns of development. They create the climate for investment. Outside support is enormously important, but we have to be clear that those foundations for sustainable development are laid inside the countries around investment. So within that context, I think there are some specific things that we really have to do. The first is to recognize that what's been agreed at COP29 does carry with it a quadrupling by 2035 and a tripling by 2030 of the finance that flows from the multilateral development banks and the multilateral climate funds. That's a very big deal, because that kind of finance comes at 4 or 5 percentage points for the cost of capital. So many countries in the developing world are paying 20% or more for their capital. So those flows are very important. The way in which they can share risk and bring in the private sector, they have to do much better at that, but they can share the risk, manage and reduce and share the risk, which gives the private sector a much stronger potential for driving forward with investment and its finance. So from this perspective of investment and sustainable development, number one, quadrupling the flows from the multilateral development banks. And that's really, really easy. You need probably into those banks something like 10 or $15 billion a year for 10 years. It's small change because of the leverage that they can bring to bear. So that quadrupling, which is the heart of the story, really doesn't cost very much. The UK's share of that would be a few $100 million a year for 8 or 9 years. So that, I think, is critical, and it's much less difficult than some people suggest. The second is the whole story of innovative finance. It would be great if we could start to think about putting in place taxation on marine fuels and air fuels. And you can get to some quite big numbers if you go there. The third thing, responding to your question, Bob, is that with the stepping back of the United States, there's a space for leadership. And Keir Starmer actually, right at the beginning, started stepping in to that place for leadership with his opening statement and the strong NDC for the UK. Now, the UK is not a very big country, but remains to be seen how China will see this new space. And I think China's thinking that through. Now, there's one scenario that says, well, if they're not going to do very much, we're not going to be doing very much. And I think China would recognize that as a serious mistake in terms of its own interests, potential for leadership, the kind of exports it can make and so on. So I'd be extremely interested in how China analyzes now that space for leadership. And the 15th five-year plan is going to be enormously important. Just look at the numbers, 30% of world emissions. The 15th five-year plan, 2026 to 2030, is absolutely critical. So I would encourage my Chinese friends to leave their NDC as late as they possibly can, because by the time you get into the middle of next year, they will know what the 15th five-year plan looks like. And it may well be quite ambitious on these fronts. If they're pushed to give their NDC too early, then they'll be cautious because they'll be not sure what the 15th five-year plan will contain. So I think that leadership will see people stepping in, the UK, Brazil, China. How that happens is going to be enormously important. And the biggest event in our climate futures is the 15th five-year plan, because that's where the big numbers are. But of course, elsewhere is enormously important. So finally, in that spirit again, Bob, I think that what we're going to see in the G20 next year is the South African presidency. And so that will be India, Brazil, South Africa in order. Three very big, actually preceded by Indonesia. After that, after South Africa's presidency next year is the presidency of the United States. And we all know who the president of the United States is. So that presidency, which is still, I think, going to be seen as a little bit of a troika of India, Brazil, South Africa, I think is enormously important, because the leadership in this story should in large measure come from the developing world. And that is a chance, really, building on Brazil's presidency of the G20 this year and COP30 and South Africa's presidency of the G20. That is another chance, Bob, of seeing a leadership which is outside the United States. Europe, if it's got any sense and organization, the bit of Europe that's not the UK, the bigger bit, I think also should see this as an opportunity to lead.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. And I'm going to let Alison have the final word appropriately, what you'd like to see or what you hope to see happen over the next 12 months leading up to COP30.
Yeah, thank you. So, building off what others have said, I mean, the first point is that this year is just such a critical year for the NDC cycle. There's a couple of NDCs that have come forward already, and as Nick has already said, what the major emitters do here matters the most, and we need those NDCs to be, to meet the scale of the challenge, basically. And for countries to stretch themselves as they put those forward. And then, of course, by the time we get to Belém, we will know where we stand in terms of what these NDCs are adding up to, and then how far the gap is to 1.5. And then the response to that in Belém is going to be very important. So there's a whole kind of ambition cycle angle to this next year, which is going to be really important for keeping 1.5 in reach. Linked to that, the second point is what I was describing in the previous answer around following up on the energy transition package. Fossil fuels, we agreed to transition away from that in Dubai, and I think that needs to be a prominent part of the Belém outcome, as it got skipped this year. And then finally, just to say, I do think there is a real opportunity, whatever everybody thinks about the finance goal, and I think, as I said at the beginning, it was important that it was agreed and it was a step forward, and now we need to build on it. So this is the year coming up where we can build on it, set out more what was meant by that commitment, and then in particular, I think this roadmap to the 1.3 trillion is a real opportunity to set out a kind of credible vision of how we actually get there and support developing countries to make the transition. Maybe just then one final word is one of the things that is, I think one of the narratives that's coming through very strongly from the UK government is around, whatever's happening with the US election, whatever's happening with the process, the acting is in our national interest. And I think the more that narrative gets promoted globally, and then the more that, each individual country starts to view it in that way, the better. And hopefully that can really be embedded next year as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Alison. And we have reached the end of our time. So thank you to all of the audience for some stimulating questions over the past 90 minutes. Thank you in particular to our panel, Jodie Ann, Nick, Timo and Alison, for all those insights. And in particular, Alison, thank you again for your leadership. The UK has a strong history of very high quality lead negotiators over successive years, and we wish you luck in your new role with the UN Secretary General as well, and we look forward to the new negotiating team that will be in place in the UK. This has been recorded, so if you missed any part of this or you want to recommend it to friends, it will be posted on the Grantham Research Institute website shortly, hopefully later today or tomorrow. And for more information about the work around the Grantham Research Institute, you can also find that. And I also want to thank Alex Burrows in particular for having dealt with all the technical issues. So let's keep our fingers crossed for the next 12 months and hope that we have a very productive 12 months and a very successful COP30. So thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.